little bit more, not about your book, I'm sorry, but about how it was, let us say, transplanted into the movie. How did the idea came up?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I thought I didn't want to see the film again because I've seen it so many times. But the last time I saw it was about 12 years ago, and I surprised myself. I really enjoyed watching it. Did you enjoy it?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, it's quite moving. I was surprised how good it was. I'd forgotten that because when the film came out, I went to the premiere in Los Angeles, in London, in Madrid, in Johannesburg, in Cape Town. And there came a point when I was completely saturated, and I didn't want to see Invictus ever again. But now I saw it, and I thought it was better than I remember it. And also, just quite a lot of memories came back. I mean, I worked very closely with the person who wrote the script of the play. I gave him the idea for Invictus, for the poem, which I knew was Mandela's favourite poem when he was in jail. And I remember quite a lot of details, like seeing the rugby players, who obviously they weren't the real rugby players, but they did a good job of. I went to the set when they were filming Invictus. I went twice in Cape Town, and I remember one detail about Clint Eastwood, and we are talking about Clint Eastwood this week. One detail about Clint Eastwood that was really great. By the way, I hope everybody understands English, otherwise this is really ridiculous. No, I had a professor at university. I studied English literature, and he went to Japan to give a lecture on Shakespeare before 800 people. And only after the end of a 1 hour lecture, he found out no one in the audience spoke English. So there's a slight anxiety about that. No, but when I went to watch the film being made, there was a long line of people queuing up to get lunch. Around that scene when the helicopter came down with Mandela. And Matt Damon and Morgan Freeman and the other stars all had their special caravans and their spaces where they got given, smoked salmon and caviar, and the ordinary people, they just, there was a big pot full of food, of stew, and they just put it with a spoon. And the rugby players all queued up to get the food. And I noticed in the middle of the queue, like one more, was Clint Eastwood. It's quite impressive. I didn't expect that. But anyway, I haven't answered your question.
Yeah, because you have to talk about the meetings you had with Nelson Mandela, of course.
Yeah. I knew Nelson Mandela very, very well. I had many encounters with him. I interviewed him many times, and I got his blessing for the book. But the story of how the film came about is really quite, even though I say so myself, I think it's quite a remarkable story. What happened was that when you do a book like the one that I did, a non-fiction book, you write a synopsis first, what we call a proposal, and it was about 10 pages long, which I sent to my literary agent in New York, and then she went around the publishers and she sold it to a publisher, and that was great. That was the end of the job, I thought. But then one day my agent phoned me and she said, "What do you think if we send your book proposal to Hollywood?" And I thought, oh my God, these Americans, they're always so optimistic, this yes we can. So okay, fine, just send it to Hollywood. Anyway, and that was in about January, February 2006. I forgot about this Hollywood business, and I started preparing my book, and I began to do the interviews with the players, and I saw Mandela and everybody. And I was working for the Spanish newspaper El País. I'm bilingual, English and Spanish. By the way, I could be speaking in Spanish instead, if that's easier, I don't know. Anyway, and El País asked me to do an article, a magazine article about poverty in the south of the United States. So what I did, I decided to choose one particular town to focus on rather than do a general abstract thing and do it. There's a lot of towns with poverty in the south of the United States, and I chose really by chance. I chose a place called Clarksdale in Mississippi. Anyway, I went to New York first. I saw some friends from the New York Times. They put me in touch with people they had in Mississippi and I got the name of a man in Clarksdale who would help me with my story about the poverty in the south of the United States. And anyway, I got a plane from New York to Detroit, and then Detroit to Memphis, but the plane had a mechanical problem, and I arrived 24 hours later than I was supposed to. All this, I'm telling you, there is a purpose for all this detail. And I rented a car at Memphis. It was about 200 kilometers drive to Clarksdale. And I phoned this guy, this contact, who was known as Mr. Big in Clarksdale. He knew everybody. And I said, Mr. Big, or whatever his name was, I can't remember now. I'm here, hello. And he said, oh, where are you? I said, I'm on the highway just near the airport on the way to Clarksdale. He said, oh, I'm right behind you. Stop at the Kentucky Fried Chicken and we'll meet there. So I stopped at the Kentucky Fried Chicken, and 2 minutes later, this very large man, Mr. Big in every sense, very courteous southern gentleman, said, look, you follow me, I'm going to lead you down to Clarksdale. And he phoned me 2 or 3 times as we were driving along. And then the third or fourth phone call, he said, Morgan Freeman is going to be in town today, would you like to meet him? And I thought, just the normal thing. I wasn't making any connections. I was just thinking, Morgan Freeman, I'll just shake his hand and say, I love your movies, and maybe ask for an autograph, and that was it. So anyway, just before we get to Clarksdale, Mr. Big turns off the highway down a small road, and we stop at a very small airport where there's a silver private jet, out of which comes Morgan Freeman, who is also a pilot. He has his own plane, but he's also the pilot of his own plane. Amazing. So I get introduced to Morgan Freeman, and it's just a typical thing, hello, how are you? I'm so pleased, I love your movies, I loved you in Shawshank Redemption, all this kind of thing. And I kind of forgot about it. And then I went off to do my stories, and I interviewed the nuns and the people at the prison. And that afternoon, Mr. Big came to fetch me, and he came round to take me out to dinner, and I got into the car, and sitting in the back was Morgan Freeman reading a newspaper. And he was very dry, I said, oh, hello, sort of amazed, and he just sort of raised an eyebrow to say, hello, and he just ignored me. So we just drove to Mr. Big's very big house, and we went into the sitting room. Mr. Big went into the kitchen to get a bottle of white wine, and I was left alone with Morgan Freeman, who doesn't talk very much. So suddenly, the light came on in my head, and I said, Mr. Freeman, it's your lucky day, I've got a movie for you. And he said, oh really? And he raised not one eyebrow, but 2 eyebrows, and he said, what's it about? And I thought, well, I better be really economic in my choice of words with this man. So I said, it's about an event that defines the essence of Nelson Mandela's genius and the essence of the South African political miracle. And he said to me, oh, you mean the rugby game? And I was astonished. I thought, how on earth you make the connection so quickly? And then he told me that he'd actually been wanting to play the part of Nelson Mandela in a film for years. He had bought the movie rights to Nelson Mandela's official autobiography. Half a dozen screenwriters had tried to adapt this great big book into a movie. They failed. And I said, okay, this is all very interesting, Mr. Freeman, but I don't understand how you made the connection to the rugby game. And he said, well, you must be the guy who's written this book proposal, right? And I said, yes. He said, well, I've read it. And then we went to have dinner, and we spent the whole of the night talking like old friends. And on the basis of that meeting, everything else happened. And the screenplay was written, and Clint Eastwood saw it. And my agent called and told me, Clint Eastwood is looking at the screenplay. I said, get out of here, this is ridiculous. And then she phoned me a month later and said, are you sitting down? Yes. Clint Eastwood wants to make a movie. And if Clint Eastwood wants to make a movie, the money appears and the movie is made.
But meanwhile, you met Nelson Mandela, you had met him
a lot.
And what about his opinion about the movie, about the idea?
What did he think about that?
Yeah.
Oh no, well I don't know what he thought about it. See, the thing is, no, I knew Mandela very well. I was there on the day of his release, I was there on the day of his first press conference, I asked a question at his first press conference. I had many, many conversations with him after speeches.
You were living in South Africa?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was a
Yeah.
correspondent for the Independent of London. I was permanently based there. I arrived a year before his release, and I got to know him very well, and he knew me very well. And I mean, for example, when I left South Africa after 6 years, I sent him a message saying I'm leaving, and he immediately invited me round to lunch, and he gave a speech about me. So you know, I have a history with Mandela. It's the great good fortune and privilege of my life. But when the time of the movie came out, he was old, and his brain was not as sharp as you see in that movie. And he didn't really entirely know what was going on. It's sad, but I doubt very much that he saw that film, or at least that if he saw it, if he understood it from beginning to end. He would have been confused, because I saw him about 6 months before he died at the last time, and he was kind of in a cloud. He was in and out. He came in and out, you know.
And what about the experience of the shooting of the movie with Clint Eastwood?
Yeah, the shooting of the movie. Well, I went twice, and the first time I went with my son, who was then 9 years old, and Clint Eastwood was very nice to my son, so I shall always defend Clint Eastwood, even if he is a right-wing, crazy conservative nut. I don't care. He was nice to my 9-year-old boy, so he's forgiven everything. And Morgan Freeman, we spent a lot of time with him in the same hotel. My son had breakfast with him every morning, and we went to have dinner with Matt Damon and his family. I mean, I remember with Clint Eastwood, that he queued up with all the extras to eat lunch, which was quite revealing about him. He was very, very simple in his approach. I remember him telling me that he said, directing a movie, he said, is like carpentry. And I said, like carpentry? He said, yeah, you just cut pieces of wood and then you stick them together one next to the other. He just reduced the whole thing to a very simple sort of mechanical exercise. But then we spoke quite a bit there, and we spoke again at the premiere in Los Angeles. Oh, there's another story about Los Angeles too. But the thing is about Clint Eastwood, I'm not an expert on Clint Eastwood films. Maybe one of you or some of you here are, but I've seen, everyone's seen a lot of Clint Eastwood films. And a couple of things I'd say about Invictus that are different. One is that I think it's the only one that I'm aware of all Clint Eastwood's film career as an actor and director, which is not set in the United States or has an American setting. I think it's the first and maybe only time that he's done a film about an entirely foreign context, which is very unusual. And then the other thing about Clint Eastwood is that I associate him with films that are about vengeance, right? It's always vengeance. The Outlaw Josie Wales, there's a terrible killing and raping and massacring, and then he spends the rest of the movie avenging it. Dirty Harry is always doing vengeance. I saw American Sniper today. It's about vengeance. And for the first time, Clint Eastwood, who seemed to be very much like on a railway track of vengeance movies, eye for an eye movies, suddenly he sees this, which completely astonishes him. And we spoke about it a few times, and he said the reason why he was just decided to completely break new ground in his life as a film person was that he was so astonished at the generosity and open-mindedness and the absence of vengeful feelings in Nelson Mandela, and he couldn't really believe it. His brain wasn't programmed. He had his Dirty Harry brain, and because Clint Eastwood and Nelson Mandela are not a natural pair. Clint Eastwood is politically known to be a very right-wing kind of guy, and Nelson Mandela was not that at all. So it's I think it's a remarkable exception to Clint Eastwood's career to do a film of this kind, and also about a sport he knew nothing about before.
That's what I was thinking. What about the shootings regarding the matches?
The shooting of the matches, well, they got all these amateur rugby players, and they did a good job.
Yeah.
I mean, Clint Eastwood got a lot of advice. I mean, he got a lot of help from people who were experts on the game.
Yes, because when you think of movies that have to do, for instance, with boxing, there is all this kind of choreography, and what regards rugby, it's a very specific game with very specific positions.
Yeah. No. He had the humility to get a lot of people to give him advice, and and he had these experts who were amateur rugby players or second division rugby players. I mean, for anyone who knows rugby, that wasn't quite the same standard as but I interviewed all these guys, the rugby players like Francois Pienaar, who's played by Matt Damon, and all these other guys. They're much bigger than the people you see here. And the amazing thing was that I interviewed about 10 of the 15 players, and these guys are the sort of biggest, toughest guys in the world. You know, you just don't get tougher guys than these rugby guys. And yet all of them, without exception, they cried, they wept, they shed tears when I interviewed them. And it was never in recollection of their personal glory, it was always when they remembered Mandela. These gigantic monster men, suddenly, I mean, there was one guy, the guy who was in charge of stopping Jonah Lomu, you know, the great big New Zealand guy, the guy who stopped him, he just didn't stop crying for an hour. I mean, just all the time. And it's just the effect that Mandela had on people. He just brought out the best in people. Even people who were sort of superficially the most racist, you know, horrible people in the world. Somehow he looked through all that, and he kind of saw that it's only because of circumstances of life that you end up being right wing or left wing. But if you just go a bit deeper and you try and find the good in people, you'll find it. And that's what he did again and again and again. Not just with the rugby players, but with really, you know, dangerous right wing racists.
And also dangerous players, because there was Lomu on the other side. And as far as you can tell us in your book, even Nelson Mandela actually scared.
Oh yeah. Johnny Lomu is the most sort of formidable rugby player there's ever been. But Mandela stood before him, before the game. You don't really get to see it in the film, but in reality, Johnny Lomu was completely intimidated.
Yeah, because it was the only person from the opposite team that actually exchanged some words.
Yeah.
And they said, well, I'm a little scared.
But I think Mandela had a moment of evil there, actually. I mean, he did something. He got into Jonah Lomu's head and somehow, you know, just scrambled his brains.
Yes, because they actually were able to stop him in the first 2-3 meters, because they knew if he would run 4 meters.
Exactly. You couldn't let him have 3 or 4 strides because then you were finished. But there's one thing which I was reminded now. You know, you see briefly in the film the difficult relationship he has with his family, and in particular with his daughter, right? His daughter's called Zinzi Mandela. Now, I myself had a very difficult relationship with Winnie and Zinzi, because I wrote more stories than any other journalist about all the terrible crimes that Winnie Mandela did. I mean, Winnie Mandela was responsible. She became a sort of mafia queen in Soweto, and she was directly or indirectly responsible for the murders of quite a lot of young black men. And I wrote about this, and Winnie would, I mean, she publicly denounced me and accused me of being a military spy and a security police. So it was all quite, and so Zinzi, who I was quite friendly with for a while, she joined with her mother. And so I went to the premiere of the movie in Los Angeles, and I'm sitting down, suddenly sitting next to me is Zinzi Mandela, that person you see there, with whom I have this difficult history. And so it's a bit cold and a bit weird, we sort of greet each other. But then, towards the end of the movie, with about 5 minutes to go, she holds my hand. And she holds my hand for the last 5 minutes of the movie. And just says, you know, a bit what Pienaar said to Mandela, thank you for what you've done for our country. And at the party afterwards, Zinzi and I were sort of, you know, we were best friends. So we were reconciled by that movie too, and I'd forgotten about that until I saw the character playing the role of Zinzi Mandela.
I think we could take some questions.
Sure.
From anyone here who wants. Well, Matt Damon wasn't that high, you know, that tall.
No. Matt Damon told me the first time he went round to Francois Pienaar's home, and he got slightly shocked at how enormous Francois Pienaar was, much bigger than him. But Matt Damon did a very good job of the South African accent. Morgan Freeman's accent was really bad, by the way, in terms of capturing Mandela. But the amazing thing is how Freeman really captured the spirit of Mandela. So much that it didn't matter that he continued to speak in an American accent most of the way through. I've got a friend who knew Mandela very well, who was in prison as an anti-apartheid activist. And at the end of the movie, when you see the face of the real Mandela, my friend's reaction was, "Who's that imposter?" Because Freeman had done the role of Mandela so convincingly in terms of the spirit of the guy. But if there's no questions, I mean, I can tell you some, more stuff. I mean, I can talk about Mandela all day long. I mean, I've got so many anecdotes in my head, but maybe, there's one thing you saw in the film when he tells all the white staff at the presidential office to stay, and that really, really happened. I mean, I spoke to people who were there, and they were all preparing. They all really had their boxes and they were emptying their stuff. They were going to another job on Mandela. But I'll tell you one particular story which I don't often tell, but which I think really captures the whole spirit of everything. See, the reason Mandela won the hearts of these rugby players and of all of white South Africa and got the whole of that stadium to chant Nelson, Nelson, which is an amazing thing. That stadium was 95% white. The rugby crowds were not the most progressive-minded white people in South Africa, to say the least. And he just won everybody over, including right-wing generals who were planning to go to war with him. And he did it because he had immense charm. He did it because he was clever. He's clever. He puts on the green jersey of the enemy. He's good at theatre. He learns the names of the players. It's not just, it's calculated. He's a very, very clever, manipulative politician in the best sense of the word. But the reason why, essentially, he won the hearts of everybody, even his deepest enemies, the people who most feared him, the people who saw him as we did Osama bin Laden. That's how most white South Africans saw him. The reason he did it was because at the core, underneath all the smiles and all the clever tactics and the theatrics, he transmitted a complete integrity. He was just a person, and it's something that I think we're all programmed as human beings to detect. If someone is false in some way, or we'll hear the false note, and it won't convince us. Mandela, there was this diamond-hard integrity, this diamond-hard connection between what his public message was, which was about respect, essentially, and how he behaved in every small detail of his private life. The fight against racism is basically a fight in favor of respect. And he treated the gardener, the person who washed the dishes in the kitchen, the flight attendant, everybody, and the Queen of England in exactly the same courteous, respectful way because he really felt it. So, I'll tell you a story. He went to prison and he had a jailer, the man who literally every night closed the door of his cell, was an Afrikaner. The Afrikaners was the kind of racist tribe that invented apartheid, the majority of white South Africans. He was an Afrikaner, very, very uneducated. He left school at 12 years old. And he was the guard, the jailer, who every night closed on that cell that you saw. That was the real cell that Mandela was in, that you saw in the movie there. And his name was Christo, funny name, Christo Brand. And if you think about it, one thing that's terrible about spending so many years in prison is that you never see children. Think about that. Maybe you don't all necessarily like children, but it's good to see a child from time to time, even if you're not, I like children, but you never see a child, the years pass by. Never. So Christo Brand, he was married, and that's right, Mandela became friends with him. Mandela used to say to him, Christo, I think you're a very intelligent man, you should study, you should make more of yourself and get a better job than being a prison warder. Mandela would actually write letters to Christo Brand's wife, encouraging her to encourage him to study and make more of his mind. Anyway, Christo Brand and his wife had a baby. And Christo Brand, this was now 7 or 8 years after Mandela's been in prison, of the 27 he spent in total. And Christo Brand understands the terrible thing of never seeing a child. So breaking the law, putting himself at big risk of not only losing his job, but him going to prison. He smuggles his little white baby into prison so that Mandela can hold the baby in his hands. And Christo Brown told me the story. I mean, I got to know Christo Brown very well. And he told me that Mandela was holding this little white baby, having not seen a child in 7 years. And Mandela was also shedding tears at the moment. Anyway, so Mandela, every year from then on the birthday of this boy, he was called Brown, B-R-A-A-M, Brown. On the birthday, Mandela always wrote a letter to Brown, even though initially, of course, the parents read it and not Brown. But, you know, Brown was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. Every time, on the date, Mandela from prison writes a letter to Brown, this child. Mandela comes out of prison when Brown was about maybe 14, 15. So now Brown is reading the letters himself. And even though Mandela's engaged in this incredible political struggle to persuade the white government to abandon apartheid and, you know, initiate a path to democracy, he never forgets to write a letter to Brown on the birthday. And he becomes president. And again, he writes a letter to Brown, this white Afrikaans boy, the son of his prison guard. When Mandela had his 80th birthday, which was when he was still president, there was a big party, lots of heads of state, kings, queens came from all over the world. He invited Christo Brown up, who'd never been on an aeroplane before, to go from Cape Town to Pretoria, and 2 other prison guards, these rough Afrikaner guys. They came up, they were guests of honor with, you know, King Charles and Bill Clinton and whatever. And Mandela left the presidency was in 1999, and 2 years later, he helped Brown a little bit with getting into some marine biology course at university in Cape Town. And then a year later, Brown died in a car accident, aged about 23 or 24. Mandela found out about 2 days later, and he immediately phoned Christo, his old prison guard, and said, "I'm so sorry, I want to come down to the funeral." This is a 2-hour flight. It's quite a lot for a guy who's now 85 years old. And Christo says, "Well, no, we buried him today, it's too late." And Mandela said, "Okay, but I want to see you anyway." So the next day, Mandela catches a plane down to Cape Town, goes to see the prison guard, lives in a little tiny house in a sort of poor area of Cape Town, and spends the whole day consoling the man who was his guard. See, and that's what I call integrity, my friends. That's what I call integrity. That's what I call having a real connection between the values you say you represent and actually that you really do represent. There was no political advantage or any personal advantage of any kind in Mandela to do this. He was being respectful, he was being kind and generous. To someone who, even though this was his jailer, he felt had been generous to him in jail.
This is a silly question, but do you have any idea how many hours you spent interviewing people? But I'm sorry, but
how many hours
you spent, because it had been
interviewing
hundreds.
who?
All the people that you have interviewed for your book.
Oh, for the
because
book.
it was the rugby players, the politicians. Yeah. It's something.
I've got no idea.
But when I say hours, okay.
Yeah, no. I mean, I don't know, but I mean, I interviewed a lot of people, including
for years.
No. For the book, it was over the course of a year that I went to.
Okay.
No. I mean, the thing is, I've been a journalist for 6 years, so I knew South Africa really well, and I had my Mandela stories already, but for the specific story of the rugby game and everything surrounding it, I spent a year going back and forth interviewing people. But the most important interviews were with Mandela, because as I was saying to you a bit earlier before we saw the film, the most important thing for me was to get the approval and the support of Mandela. And I went to see him in his house, and he said he understood exactly the book I was thinking of writing, and he had my full support. And of course, once I have the full support of Mandela, then everybody else has to say yes to being interviewed. I mean, they just can't say no.
Yes, please.
A very quick question. What's the process like from an author's point of view when a screenwriter is working on the script, and
Yeah.
how do you deal with that day to day?
Yeah, he's asking me what the process is of being the screenwriter. Right. Well, after this amazing meeting I had with Morgan Freeman in Mississippi, everything moved very quickly, and I signed a contract with Morgan Freeman's production company. I mean, we did a verbal agreement on the phone. I was living in Barcelona then, and the very next day, a screenwriter arrived from Los Angeles. And he was a South African guy who was now living in Los Angeles, and he spent a week more or less glued to me. We did everything except sleep together. And he just emptied my brain of everything I knew. I gave him all the interviews I'd done with all the players, and I gave him, certain ideas which I gave him, I definitely see there in the movie, like, the idea of Invictus, the poem. And for example, right at the very beginning, and it's almost the first scene, you see Mandela very carefully making his bed. And that was the thing about Mandela that I knew. I think it's one of maybe it's even the opening chapter of my book, I can't remember. But I remember that Mandela, this is not to do with the film, but he went on an official trip to China, and he was in Shanghai, and he was staying in this beautiful hotel in the presidential suite. And he would make his own bed every day. And the Chinese lady, whose job it was to clean the room, was completely freaked out. Just all the notions of order in the universe are destroyed by this, president who made his own bed. So I remember, little details like that, and details like Mandela pouring the tea for Francois Pienaar, for the Matt Damon character. That's again. And so I gave him, lots and lots of this stuff. Now, one funny thing is how people quite often tell me, we saw this quote, beautiful quote by Mandela. Did Mandela really say this? And quite often, no, he didn't. It's made up from the movie. And people then attribute lines from the fictional movie as if Mandela had said it himself. Then they go down in history as wonderful sayings of Mandela, whether were invented by a screenwriter in Hollywood, which is really quite crazy. But anyway, so really the main involvement between myself and the screenwriter was that he just emptied my brain of pretty much everything I knew, and then he went off and he worked it into his screenplay, which I then saw, and I had a few suggestions for changes, but no one paid any attention to me because Clint Eastwood was happy with it, and that was the end of that. But there is one thing which I would like to mention, actually. There's just one thing about the film, above all, that annoys me. One thing. And I didn't used to say it before when I was at the premieres, but I'll say it now, which is that the impression is given in the film that the rugby players, except for the Matt Damon, Francois Pienaar character, were reluctant. They didn't like going to play rugby with the kids, and the black kids in the townships. They didn't want to learn, the new black national anthem. And it's not true. And it really pisses me off, actually, because, unfortunately, most people are going to remember the story not from my book, but from this film. And so these white rugby players who really had made the mental change, and who they loved going out to play with the black kids, and they all very happily and enthusiastically learned to sing in Nkosi Sikelel, the old black protest anthem, now the national anthem. And so I went to these premieres in Cape Town and Johannesburg with the players, and they were all quite happy about it, but they said that bit, it really pissed them off, and it really pisses me off too. So at least before a small group of people, I'm setting the record straight, even if the world will not know this.
Yeah, because it's funny that Francois Pienaar at the time wasn't able to sing because he was so tense and so afraid that he would make any mistake. But all the other players played it.
That's true. He was afraid he'd start crying. Also, one thing which is the film doesn't really convey it enough is that the game ended at 9-9, and then they went into extra time. They played 2 times 10 minutes, and Mandela told me that was the tensest, the most high tension time of his entire life. And I said to him, but Mr. Mandela, back in 1964, you spent 2 days not knowing if you were going to be condemned to death by a judge. And he said, forget about that. Much worse than 20 minutes watching extra time in that rugby game. I have never been more tense, he said, than then.
Any more questions?
No, no.
I just want to thank you for all the info you've given us on Nelson Mandela and Morgan Freeman. There are many things that I hadn't known about before, so it was amazing.
So what did you say what I learned?
Thank you because of
Oh, I see. Okay. Oh, well, no. Okay. Well, thank you so much. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I feel so unbelievably fortunate. Above all, it just, just things of chance over which you have no control in your life that, lead you to South Africa in the first place, and then led me to get to know Mandela incredibly well. It's just so lucky that I do feel an obligation to share my experience with people, and when I get a chance, like I get invited here, I almost always when I can, I'm sort of like a disciple, like the Saint Paul with the epistles, spreading the word of Nelson Mandela, because there's just no one like him in the world today, and I think people like Mandela appear in the world like once every 100 years. It's like Hitler arrives once every 100 years, and Mandela arrives once every 100 years. Mandela was the absolute anti-Hitler in every single detail that you can imagine. Everything that's terrible about Hitler is just Mandela's the absolute opposite. He was generous, he was not tribal, he did not distinguish between races, religions, anything. He sought to bring people together, he was kind. Yeah.
No, I'm sorry, just something, because those of you who haven't read John's book, I strongly recommend it, because there are quite a lot of nuances in all this atmosphere. For instance, you mentioned the Afrikaners, but also there was a kind of racism towards the English, because there was a player, a South African player with an English background, and he was treated as if it was almost as if he were black or something. So there are quite a lot of nuances that we can get from the book, and of course it's impossible to get from a picture. You just have some signs.
But also, I don't know about this group here. I'm sure you're all sort of highly erudite, intellectual kind of people, but most people today don't have the attention span to read more than about 60 characters in a tweet. And so for those of you who struggle with the idea of reading a book that's about 280 pages long, there's another book that I've done that I really recommend. I mean, I shouldn't be abusing this, but I am, since you started it. I've got a comic book. It's a graphic novel, a book with pictures, Alice in Wonderland, at the beginning of Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, Alice says, or in Alice Through the Looking Glass, he says, what is the use of books without pictures and conversations? Well, this is a book with pictures and conversations, which you can read in about 40 minutes, and it's called Mandela and the General. And it's the most amazing story, though I say so myself, about how Mandela persuaded the most right-wing, most dangerous, most crazy guy who posed the biggest threat to democracy, to all of Mandela's dreams, how Mandela persuaded him to abandon the armed struggle. He had 40,000 people with guns. South Africa could now today easily be like Palestine, Israel. All the conditions were there for a civil war, a racial civil war. And that's really Mandela's great achievement, that actually he stopped. Now we're wondering how on earth are we going to stop the Israel-Palestine thing? How on earth are we going to stop Ukraine-Russia? How are we going to stop other wars? Mandela went a step before that. He stopped the war from happening in the first place. And this comic book, which you'll find in various languages, I'm sure it's in Portuguese too, called Mandela and the General. It's an easy way of just getting to the heart of just how totally remarkable Mandela was.
And he also managed the reconciliation between the general and his brother.
And his brother, exactly. So you want to tell a story about the brother?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Well, I'll tell you quickly the story. I mean, I'll try and make it brief because, and this is probably enough, you probably want to go home after that. So, this guy was called General Constant Viljoen. And he had been the head of the South African Defence Force, Army, Navy, Air Force, in the early 80s, at the time of maximum repression and maximum rebellion by black people. So he was really the enforcer of apartheid. Then he retired, Mandela came out of prison, he was in his farm, and all these ultra right-wingers went to him, and they went to the farm and said, General, you must lead us against the terrorist, communist, black, whatever, Nelson Mandela. And so this guy came out of retirement, you know, like some kind of mythological Greek figure or something, and he held this like a Nuremberg rally. It was an amazingly Hitlerian event with all these people wearing brown uniforms with kind of swastikas. I was there, and he was talking about, you know, it's the second freedom struggle of our nation, and now we will all lay our lives, you know, we will, you know, for our children, for our language, for our religion, and it was a big deal, and there were about 40,000 people with guns and with military training who were ready to go to war. So this guy, this General, Constant Viljoen, had a brother, a twin brother. I interviewed them both, they're identical. And the twin brother was a complete anti-apartheid, very religious Christian man who had been absolutely, you know, went a completely different path from his brother. And I interviewed them both. It was really weird. I mean, talking to this complete raging, racist, dangerous son of a bitch, and this sweet, nice, you know, black, lovely black people, anti-apartheid, exactly the same face in front of me. Bonkers. Anyway, Mandela contacted the good brother and said, look, I want to talk to the bad brother. Can you help organize it? So he got a message for his brother, and Mandela, about 3 or 4 months after this Nuremberg rally, this was only discovered years later, I only found out, no one knew at the time, it wasn't in the news, but he organized a clandestine meeting with this general who was going to destroy his dream. And the general came round to see him at his house. I mean, you've got to give the general credit. He had the moral courage to go to Mandela's house with a couple of other guys. And I spoke to the general some years later in a bar in Cape Town, and he told me, everything I'm going to tell you now was what the general told me. He said he knocked at the door of Mandela's house. He was expecting a servant to open the door, but actually Mandela opened the door with a big smile on his face. And he greeted him in his language, in Afrikaans, which he had learned in prison, specifically in preparation for a day like this. And he'd also learned Afrikaans history in preparation for a day like this. And so the general is completely confused. He's expecting, you know, kind of ISIS, sort of terrorists, you know, who kill babies. And he's got this guy with a big smile who greets him with immense politeness in his language. And Mandela says, General, I'd like to have a little conversation, just the two of us, before our delegations meet. And they sit down at a table. And I think this is where the screenwriter got the idea for the tea, because the general told me, he said, Mandela said, do you take tea? and the general said, yes please, and said Mandela poured me the tea. And he said, and do you take milk, General? Yes, a little bit. He said, Mandela poured me the milk. He said, do you take sugar? 1 spoon. He said, Mandela put the spoon in. And I remember the general looking at me and saying, all I had to do was stir it. You know, he was just completely disarmed and confused. This is, you know, Mandela's just this nightmare for him. It was gonna... Anyway, so they start talking. And Mandela says, look, I understand, General, that you're planning to go to war against, you know, everything that I've been fighting for all my life in jail and everything. And he said, is that correct? And the general's an honest guy. He said, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. And Mandela said, okay, but I put it to you, General, that if this war happens that you're planning, you will have the arms, the weapons, the skill at military training and all that, but we will have the numbers and we will have international support. Do you agree, General? The General says, yeah, I agree. So therefore, General, I put it to you that if you go to war, there is only one possible outcome, That is the peace of the cemeteries. Do you agree, General? The General goes, yeah, I guess so. And so Mandela says, well, then I think we should continue talking, exploring ways to avoid. This is all happening about a year and a half before this rugby game that we've just seen now. 6 months before Mandela becomes president in the elections. Anyway, they have 2 or 3 more clandestine meetings, and again, coming back to my point I was making before about integrity, the General finds that he's been more and more persuaded by Mandela, more and more seduced by his charm, but also by the solidity of his arguments. And he reaches a point where he feels he can't go to war against this guy. Jesus, how am I going to tell my 40,000 guys? How am I going to explain this? And he said he spent a long time and he just kept on asking himself, can I trust Mandela? Can I trust him? It boiled down to a question of integrity. And in the end, the General decided, yes, I can trust Mandela. And he ordered his men, 40, and they were men, not women, men, drop your guns. It's the end of the war. A few of them carried on, and they put a few bombs, but a small amount. And not only did the General call off the war, he actually legitimized Mandela's entire project by creating a political party and taking part in the elections. And he had this little tiny party of Afrikaners, and out of 650 members of parliament, his party had about 4. But there they were. And just to finish the story, and I think probably you've had enough of this story, but I think it's a nice way to end it, perhaps. I mean, you decide whether we continue or not, but 2 or 3 days after Mandela was officially inaugurated as president, round about our birthdays, by the way, it was the opening of the first democratic parliament in history of South Africa, in which you had people of all races. I'd been in that parliament building before. It was only white men and maybe 1 or 2 white women, and that was it. And suddenly, you had this parliament with all the colours of the rainbow, and everybody was there, about 35–40% women, all Indians, Asian origin, African, everything, everybody was there, and it was like a party. And Mandela was the last person in, and when he came in, the whole place exploded. It was like being at a rock concert, like Mick Jagger, or maybe no, I'll be more modern, Taylor Swift. Imagine Taylor Swift. I mean, everybody went crazy as if Taylor Swift or Mick Jagger, depending on the generation, had walked in. And Mandela, I was in there, I was in the building, at the top of the building, watching. And Mandela came in, and before he took his seat, for the first time ever, his seat as president in the multi-racial parliament, he saw the General on the other side. And he went over to the General, and I remember seeing him. And they exchanged words, but I didn't know what they said. So years later, I'm with the General in a bar. So I said, General, what happened? What did he say? And he said, he came up to me and he said, General, it is wonderful to see you here. Thank you very much for participating in this. And I asked the General, I said, and what did you respond? He said, I didn't respond to anything. I'm a military man, and he was my president, so I saluted. Amazing, huh? And then I took the General home. This was in about 2003. I took the General home. He lived in a house called El Alamein after one of the big battles of the Second World War. And I dropped him off, and it's the last time I saw the General. He's now dead. But he had these sort of steely blue eyes, and he was very sort of erect and military. And the last thing he said to me, he looked me in the eyes, we shook hands, and he said, Mandela is the greatest of men.
Thank you so much.